The boardroom door slammed shut with a finality that made the glass walls shudder. Mara Vance didn't flinch. She kept her eyes forward, her manicured fingers resting lightly on the contract that would change everything. Across the table, Julian Roth leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth like he'd already won a game no one else knew they were playing. 6 months, Julian said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. That's all I need to secure the Davenport merger. After that, we can reassess our arrangement. Mara signed her name with practiced elegance. 6 months, she repeated, her tone betraying nothing. What she didn't say was that 6 months ago, she'd walked away from a different kind of arrangement entirely, one that had felt suffocating in its ordinariness. Ethan Cole had been predictable, comfortable, and ultimately forgettable. Or so she'd convinced herself. The memory surfaced unbidden. Ethan sitting across from her in their modest apartment, his expression unreadable as she explained why she was leaving. He hadn't argued. Hadn't begged. He'd simply nodded, asked if she needed help packing, and returned to whatever he'd been reading on his tablet. That reaction had validated her decision at the time. Now, standing in Julian's world of marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, she wondered why that memory still carried the faint sting of something unfinished. "Earth to Mara," Julian's voice cut through her thoughts. "You're not getting cold feet already, are you?" "Not even warm ones," she replied, meeting his gaze. "When do we make the announcement?" "Tonight. The Rothschild Gala. Every person who matters will be there." He stood, buttoning his suit jacket with the kind of casual confidence that came from never having been told no. "Wear something that photographs well. The society pages eat this stuff up." As Mara left the building, her phone buzzed. A text from her sister, Simone. "Heard about you and Julian Roth. Big moves. Mom would have been proud." Mara's thumb hovered over the reply field, then she pocketed the phone without responding. Her mother would have asked questions Julian's money couldn't answer. Questions Ethan had never needed to ask because he'd somehow already known the answers. Across the city, in an office that didn't announce itself with brass nameplates or designer furniture, Ethan Cole sat in a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. 3 people occupied the space with him. None of them spoke until he did. "The Davenport situation," Ethan said quietly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "What's the timeline?" A woman in her 50s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, slid a folder across the table. "Julian Roth is moving fast. He needs board approval by the end of the quarter. He's leveraging the Vance connection for optics." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Mara's involved. Contractually engaged as of this morning. It's all over the financial blogs." The woman, whose name was Dr. Helen Morse, had known Ethan long enough to recognize the microscopic tension in his jaw. "Does that complicate things?" "No," Ethan said, and it was the truth. Complications implied entanglement. What he felt was closer to observation, the kind anthropologists might experience watching a familiar pattern repeat itself in an unfamiliar context. "Julian doesn't know what he's actually trying to acquire, does he?" A younger man, Marcus, chuckled darkly. "He thinks Davenport is a tech firm with decent patents. He has no idea it's a shell for the Kensington Group's Asian pipeline." "Then he's going to find out," Ethan said, standing. "Make sure the discovery happens slowly enough that he commits resources he can't retrieve." Helen raised an eyebrow. "You're playing the long game." "I'm not playing anything," Ethan corrected. "I'm just not stopping what's already in motion." The room fell silent as he left, his footsteps barely audible on the worn carpet. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual afternoon chaos, but Ethan moved through it like a man walking through a museum, observing but untouched. That evening, the Rothschild Gala transformed the Preston Grand Hotel into something out of a fever dream. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across marble floors. Men in tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than most people's cars drifted between conversations like schools of tropical fish, beautiful and utterly unaware of the ecosystem that sustained them. Mara arrived on Julian's arm, and the room noticed. Cameras flashed. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Julian soaked it in like sunlight, his hand proprietary on the small of her back. "Smile," he murmured. "This is the part where we look hopelessly in love." Mara's smile was perfect, practiced. But her eyes scanned the room with a different kind of attention, the way someone might search a crowded beach for a familiar face they're not sure they want to find. She didn't find Ethan. He wasn't there. At least, not in any way she would have recognized. Near the bar, partially obscured by a marble column, Ethan stood in a suit that didn't announce its price tag but didn't need to. He wasn't networking. Wasn't schmoozing. He was simply present, a glass of water in his hand, watching the room with the detached interest of someone reading a particularly predictable novel. "You're not drinking." The voice belonged to Thomas Ashford, a silver-haired venture capitalist whose portfolio could buy and sell small countries. "Never do these things," Ethan replied. "Smart man." Thomas followed Ethan's gaze across the room to where Julian and Mara held court. "What do you make of that pairing?" "I make nothing of it," Ethan said. "People choose what they think they want. The market corrects eventually." Thomas laughed, the sound genuine. "You sound like my ex-wife's therapist." He paused, then added, "Julian's making a move on Davenport." "You heard?" "I heard. And he should read the fine print," Ethan said quietly. "The devil's always in the details." Across the room, Mara felt it before she saw it. That particular quality of attention that wasn't quite staring but wasn't quite looking away either. She turned her head slightly, scanning faces, and for just a moment, her eyes locked with Ethan's. The recognition was mutual and instantaneous. Ethan raised his glass slightly, the gesture so small it might have been imagined. Then he turned and disappeared into the crowd like smoke. Mara's breath caught. Julian, mid-conversation with a congressman, didn't notice her distraction. But she noticed the way her heart had kicked against her ribs, the way her carefully constructed composure had fractured just enough to let in a single, unwelcome question. "What is he doing here?" Julian's voice pulled her back. "Darling, I want you to meet Senator Hawkins. He's very interested in our plans." Mara extended her hand, smiled, said all the right things. But part of her mind had already left the room, chasing the ghost of a man she thought she'd left behind in a different, smaller life. Later, as the gala wound down and the crowd thinned, Julian pulled her aside near the grand staircase. "That went perfectly," he said, his satisfaction evident. "Did you see the way Richardson practically salivated when I mentioned the Davenport merger? We're golden." "I saw Ethan," Mara said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Julian's expression shifted, amusement coloring his features. "Your ex? The analyst? Here?" He looked around as if expecting to find Ethan serving drinks. "Are you sure? This isn't exactly his tax bracket." "I'm sure." Julian shrugged, already losing interest. "Probably crashed. Or maybe he works catering now. Either way, it's not our problem." He kissed her temple, the gesture performative even in private. "Come on. We have an early meeting with the Davenport board." As they left, Mara glanced back once more at the emptying ballroom. Somewhere in this city, Ethan was returning to whatever life he led now. And despite everything she'd chosen, everything she'd convinced herself she wanted, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just seen something important and completely missed its meaning. What she didn't know, what Julian couldn't have guessed, was that Ethan had left the gala an hour earlier and was now sitting in a secure conference room 7 blocks away, reviewing documents that would systematically dismantle everything Julian Roth thought he was building. The first domino had been placed months ago. The second would fall tomorrow. And by the time Julian realized he wasn't playing chess but rather had been a piece on someone else's board, it would be far too late to do anything but watch the inevitable unfold. Ethan closed the last folder and stood, his reflection ghost-like in the dark window. Somewhere out there, Mara was probably wondering why he'd been at the gala. The truth was simpler than she'd imagined and more complicated than Julian could comprehend. He'd been there because he was always there, moving through rooms and decisions and consequences with the quiet authority of someone who understood that real power never needed to announce itself. It just waited. The Davenport board meeting began at 9 sharp, in a conference room that smelled of leather and old money. Julian arrived 15 minutes early, which he considered fashionably punctual. Mara accompanied him, her role clearly decorative but strategically important. The board members, 7 men and 2 women ranging from late 50s to early 70s, greeted Julian with the kind of polite warmth reserved for people they hadn't yet decided to trust. "Gentlemen, ladies," Julian began, his presentation already loaded on the screen behind him. "What I'm proposing isn't just a merger. It's a revolution in how we approach integrated tech solutions." He spoke for 20 minutes, his pitch polished to a mirror shine. Market projections. Synergy potential. Revenue streams that branched like rivers feeding an ocean. The board listened with expressions that revealed nothing, and Julian interpreted their silence as contemplation rather than what it actually was, prior knowledge. Questions. Julian asked, confident there would be few. An older woman, her white hair pulled back in a severe bun, spoke first. "Mr. Roth, your projections assume Davenport's patent portfolio remains intact through the transition. What's your contingency if that assumption proves incorrect?" Julian's smile didn't waver. "Our legal team has thoroughly vetted the intellectual property. Everything is secured and transferable." "Has it?" The woman's tone was mild, but something in it made Mara sit up straighter. "Because our records show 3 of our core patents are actually licensed through a parent holding company. The Kensington Group. Are you familiar with them?" The room temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. Julian's pause lasted only a second, but Mara caught it. "Kensington Group is mentioned in the preliminary documentation, yes. Standard corporate structure. Nothing that impacts the merger." "Standard," the woman repeated, as if tasting the word. "Interesting choice of words. The licensing agreements expire in 4 months. Renewal terms are at the discretion of Kensington's primary stakeholders. Without those patents, Davenport's valuation drops approximately 63%. Did your legal team vet that?" Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We'll negotiate the renewal as part of the acquisition." "With whom?" another board member asked, a man whose jowls and expensive watch suggested he'd been on more boards than Julian had attended meetings. "Kensington doesn't negotiate. They dictate. And they're notoriously selective about their partnerships." The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, but the energy had shifted. By the time Julian and Mara left, his confident stride had shortened, his shoulders carrying tension that hadn't been there before. In the elevator, Mara spoke carefully. "Did you know about the Kensington issue?" "It's not an issue," Julian snapped, then softened his tone immediately. "It's a detail. A negotiable detail. My team will handle it." But as they stepped onto the street, Julian's phone was already pressed to his ear, his voice sharp as he barked orders at whoever had the misfortune of answering. Mara watched him pace, gesticulate, command. Everything she thought she wanted. Everything that suddenly felt like watching a performance she'd seen before but with different actors. That afternoon, Ethan sat in a significantly less impressive office, reviewing the same information Julian was just discovering. Helen sat across from him, a tablet in her lap displaying real-time updates from their monitoring systems. "He's scrambling," she reported. "Called his entire legal team. They're digging into Kensington's structure now." "How long until they find the firewalls?" Ethan asked. "If they're competent." 3 days. If they're what Julian can afford. A week, maybe 2. Ethan nodded, his expression unchanged. And the renewal terms? Already drafted. Kensington is willing to extend the licensing agreements. Helen paused. For triple the current rate and a seat on Davenport's board. Julian won't accept those terms. No, Helen agreed. He won't. Which means Davenport's board will start looking for alternative buyers. People who already have Kensington relationships. People like. Helen smiled, thin and precise. Well, technically, people like you. Though they don't know that yet. Ethan stood, moving to the window. Below, the city churned on, oblivious to the quiet redistribution of power happening in rooms like this one. Make sure they find out slowly. I want Julian to feel like he still has options until the moment he realizes he never did. You're enjoying this, Helen observed, though her tone held no judgment. I'm not, Ethan said, and it was true. There was no pleasure in this, no satisfaction. Only the cold completion of a process that had started long before Mara had walked out, before Julian had ever heard the name Davenport. This was simply what happened when people mistook visibility for power and silence for weakness. 2 days later, Mara found herself at lunch with Simone, her younger sister, at a restaurant that served portions too small and charged prices too high. Simone had the family looks but none of Mara's restraint, her opinions delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never had to calculate the cost of honesty. So, Simone said, spearing an arugula leaf. How's the contract marriage going? You look tired. It's fine, Mara lied. Julian's dealing with some business complications, but nothing serious. Complications like your ex showing up at your engagement gala? Mara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. How did you know about that? You posted about it. Well, someone tagged you in photos, and I have eyes. Simone leaned forward. What was Ethan doing there? That place costs more than his annual salary just to walk through the door. I don't know, Mara admitted. Maybe he was someone's +1. Simone's laugh was sharp. Ethan. Mr. I read financial reports for fun. He didn't have friends with gala money. Unless. She trailed off, her eyes narrowing. Unless we didn't actually know him as well as we thought. The suggestion hung between them like smoke. Mara wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it away, but something stopped her. Small things, meaningless in isolation but strange in aggregate. The way Ethan had always paid cash, never carried debt. How his analyst job never seemed to require him to go to an actual office. The phone calls he'd take in the other room, his voice low and authoritative in a way that didn't match his supposed position. You're overthinking, Mara said, but the words felt hollow. Probably, Simone agreed, though her expression said otherwise. But if I were you, I'd be curious. Especially now that your new fiance is apparently having business trouble with a company Ethan might have connections to. Ethan doesn't have connections to Davenport. But he might have connections to Kensington. Simone pulled out her phone, tapped a few times, then turned the screen toward Mara. I did some digging. Kensington Group is a holding company. Private. No public shareholders. But they have tentacles in everything from tech patents to real estate development to venture capital. And you know what's weird? I can't find a single name attached to their executive leadership. It's all trustees and proxies. Mara stared at the phone, at the web of corporate structures that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Simone said, pulling her phone back. I'm just saying that maybe the man you thought was boring was actually just quiet. There's a difference. That night, Mara couldn't sleep. Julian snored softly beside her in his penthouse bedroom, but she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind refusing to settle. At 2 in the morning, she gave up, slipped out of bed, and padded to Julian's home office. She told herself she was just curious. That she had every right to understand the business situation she was now publicly tied to. But as she opened Julian's laptop, the password he'd arrogantly saved in plain sight, she knew she was looking for something else entirely. The documents were there, barely hidden. Emails between Julian's team and various corporate entities. Legal briefs about the Kensington licensing issue. And in one thread, buried 6 messages deep, a name that made her breath catch. Reference contact, E. Cole, Kensington Advisory Board. It couldn't be. Ethan Cole was a common enough name. Could be anyone. Could be coincidence. Except Mara didn't believe in coincidences anymore, not after seeing Ethan at the gala, not after Simone's research, not after the way every instinct she'd spent years learning to trust was suddenly screaming that she'd missed something catastrophically obvious. She closed the laptop, her hands trembling slightly. In the bedroom, Julian continued sleeping, unaware that the woman he'd contracted to marry was unraveling a truth he hadn't yet discovered himself. Across the city, Ethan was also awake, though he was working rather than worrying. His apartment, modest and unremarkable from the outside, contained systems that would have looked at home in a corporate security center. Multiple monitors displayed information streams from around the world. Markets. News feeds. Corporate filings. The digital pulse of an economy most people experienced but few understood. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Roth's team found the Kensington connection. They're going to approach directly. Ethan typed back. Let them. Schedule the meeting for next week. Another text. You sure you want to be in the room? A pause. Then, yes. It's time. Ethan set the phone down and returned to his screens. Somewhere in this city, Mara was probably asleep next to a man who thought power was something you bought with money and displayed with publicity. Julian would learn differently soon enough. They all would. The question Ethan hadn't yet answered, even to himself, was why it mattered that Mara understood. She'd made her choice. He'd accepted it. The subsequent sequence of events had nothing to do with her and everything to do with patterns that predated their relationship by years. But he'd seen her face at the gala. That flicker of recognition followed by confusion. And some part of him, the part he'd thought had been excised through discipline and distance, wanted her to see clearly. Not for reconciliation. Not for vindication. Just for truth. Because in the end, that was all that lasted. Truth and consequences, arranged in their inevitable order, waiting patiently for everyone to catch up. The Kensington Group offices didn't exist in any meaningful public sense. No brass plaques. No corporate logos in building directories. Just a floor number in a downtown high-rise, accessible only by private elevator with a key card that Julian's assistant had to arrange through 3 intermediaries and a signed non-disclosure agreement. Julian arrived with his lawyer, David Chen, whose hourly rate could fund a modest wedding. They'd prepared for this meeting like generals planning an invasion. Market comparisons. Alternative licensing structures. Negotiation positions ranked from ideal to acceptable to absolute. What they hadn't prepared for was the room itself. The conference space was smaller than Julian expected, almost intimate. Windows overlooked the city, but the glass was treated somehow, making the world outside look distant and unreal. A single long table. 6 chairs. And at the far end, reviewing something on a tablet, sat Ethan Cole. Julian stopped walking. His brain, trained to process power dynamics in milliseconds, stuttered trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the man he dismissed as Mara's forgettable ex. Ethan wore a suit that whispered rather than shouted, his posture relaxed but somehow commanding the space around him. Mr. Roth, Ethan said, not standing. Please, sit. David moved first, his lawyer instincts overriding his confusion. Julian followed, his mind racing. I was expecting someone from Kensington's executive team. "You're speaking with them," Ethan replied calmly. He set the tablet aside, giving Julian his full attention. "I'm sorry for the confusion. Kensington maintains a small operational footprint. We prefer substance over ceremony." "You." Julian's voice was flat. "You're on Kensington's advisory board." "I chair it," Ethan corrected gently. "Along with managing our strategic acquisitions and licensing portfolio. Has been my role for about 8 years now." The silence that followed was profound. David cleared his throat, flipping open his briefcase with hands that weren't quite steady. "Mr. Cole, we're here to discuss the Davenport licensing agreements. Our client is prepared to offer competitive terms for renewal as part of his acquisition proposal." Ethan nodded as if this was perfectly reasonable. "I've reviewed Mr. Roth's proposal. The projections are ambitious. The market analysis is sound, if somewhat optimistic." He paused. "The problem is that Davenport's value is almost entirely dependent on patents that Kensington controls. Without those licenses, the company is worth approximately 40 cents on the dollar. Which is why we're here," Julian interjected, his voice harder now. "To negotiate terms that work for everyone." "I appreciate that." Ethan leaned back slightly. "Unfortunately, Kensington has a standing policy. We don't extend licensing agreements to entities engaged in hostile or aggressive acquisition strategies. It creates instability in our partner networks." David's pen stopped moving. "Mr. Roth's approach has been entirely above board. There's nothing hostile about." "I'm not questioning the legality," Ethan interrupted, his tone still mild. "I'm explaining our policy. Kensington values long-term relationships with operators who understand that markets are ecosystems, not battlegrounds. Mr. Roth's track record suggests a different philosophy." Julian's jaw clenched. "You're blocking the deal because of a philosophical disagreement." "I'm declining to facilitate a deal that doesn't align with our strategic interests," Ethan corrected. "There's a difference. This is personal." Julian stood abruptly. "This is about Mara." For the first time, Ethan's expression shifted. Not to anger, not to defensiveness. Something closer to disappointment. "Mr. Roth, if I made business decisions based on personal relationships, Kensington wouldn't exist. Mara's choices are her own. My decision regarding the Davenport licenses was made 6 months ago, long before you two announced your engagement. The timing is coincidental, not causal." "I don't believe you." Ethan stood now, his movement unhurried. "That's your prerogative. But belief doesn't change the outcome. Kensington won't be renewing Davenport's licenses under current ownership structures. If the company changes hands to an operator we trust, we'll reconsider. Until then, the patents revert to us in," he glanced at his watch, "approximately 3 months and 11 days. David tried diplomacy. "Is there any scenario where we could restructure the deal to meet your concerns?" "Several," Ethan replied. "None that Mr. Roth would accept. They'd require relinquishing majority control, accepting board oversight, and committing to profit-sharing models that don't align with his typical approach." He turned to Julian directly. "You're used to buying things, owning them completely, and extracting maximum value. Kensington doesn't work with that model. We invest in partnerships, not acquisitions." "Partnerships you control," Julian shot back. "Partnerships where everyone prospers or no one does," Ethan countered. "It's not control. It's alignment." The meeting ended 10 minutes later with nothing resolved and everything changed. Julian left the building radiating fury, David trailing behind making quiet phone calls to other board members, already trying to salvage what was rapidly becoming unsalvageable. In the car, Julian's silence was volcanic. Finally, he spoke. "He tanked the entire deal because I'm with Mara." "We don't actually know that," David said carefully. His policy explanation was consistent with Kensington's documented approach to partnerships. "I've checked. They really do operate that way." 8 years, Julian muttered. He's been running Kensington for 8 years. That means when Mara was with him, he was already. He didn't finish the sentence, the implications too massive to articulate. She didn't know. There's no way she knew. David said nothing, which was answer enough. That evening, Mara was at Julian's penthouse when he returned. She'd been waiting, having seen his calendar, having spent the entire day in a state of suspended dread since finding Ethan's name in those documents. Julian poured himself 3 fingers of scotch before speaking. "Your ex-boyfriend. The boring analyst. Want to guess what he actually does for a living?" Mara's throat went dry. "Julian. He runs Kensington Group." Julian downed half the scotch. "Not works for. Not advises. Runs. He's been running it for almost a decade. Which means the entire time you two were together, playing house in that mediocre apartment, eating takeout and watching movies like regular people, he was controlling a portfolio worth more than some country's GDP." The room tilted. Mara sat down before her legs could give out. "That's not possible." "It's very possible. It's actual. It's fact." Julian's laugh was bitter. "And you know what the best part is? He's blocking the Davenport deal. Says it doesn't align with Kensington's partnership philosophy." Partnership philosophy. Like he's some kind of corporate monk instead of a man who clearly orchestrated this entire situation to humiliate me. "He wouldn't do that," Mara said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Wouldn't he? You left him for me. I'm publicly, contractually engaged to the woman he lived with for 3 years. And suddenly he's in a position to destroy the biggest deal of my career? That's not coincidence. That's revenge." Mara's mind was reeling, trying to reconcile every memory of Ethan with this new information. The quiet evenings. The modest lifestyle. The way he'd read financial reports the way other people read novels, making comments about market movements that she'd thought were academic but now realized were strategic. How had she missed it? How had she lived with someone for 3 years and not seen what he actually was? "I need to talk to him," she said quietly. "Absolutely not." Julian's voice was sharp. "You are contractually obligated to me for 4 more months. You will not compromise this situation further by running back to your ex." "I'm not running back. I'm getting answers. The answer is that he's a manipulative bastard who hid his entire life from you and is now using his position to settle personal scores." Julian refilled his glass. "That's all you need to know." But it wasn't. Mara could see that now, the shape of something much larger than Julian's wounded pride or her own confusion. Ethan hadn't hidden his life maliciously. He'd simply lived it quietly. And she'd interpreted quiet as small, absence as emptiness, rather than what it actually was, restraint. Control. The kind of power that didn't need announcement because it was so secure it could afford invisibility. She'd left him because she thought he had no ambition, no drive, no future worth investing in. She'd chosen Julian's visible success over Ethan's invisible authority. And now the universe was holding up a mirror, showing her exactly what she'd failed to see. "I'm going for a walk," Mara announced, grabbing her coat. "Mara. I need air. I'll be back." She left before he could argue, stepping out into the city night. She didn't have a destination, just the need to move, to think, to process the fundamental recalibration of her own judgment that this revelation demanded. Her phone buzzed. A text from Simone. "Told you there was more to that story. You okay?" Mara didn't respond. She wasn't okay. She was standing on a sidewalk, watching taxis blur past, realizing that she'd spent 3 years sleeping next to a man who controlled patents, influenced markets, and apparently sat on boards that made decisions affecting millions of people. And he'd never once mentioned it. Not to impress her. Not to keep her. Not even to defend himself when she'd accused him of being complacent and directionless. He'd just let her go. Let her believe whatever she wanted to believe. Because correction would have required revelation, and revelation wasn't something Ethan did unless absolutely necessary. The question burning in her chest now was simple and terrible: why? Why the secrecy? Why the performance of ordinariness? And most importantly, why had he let her walk away without ever telling her the truth? 20 blocks away, in his understated apartment, Ethan was asking himself similar questions. Helen had called immediately after the meeting with Julian, her tone concerned. That was risky, she'd said. Meeting with him directly. Revealing your position. It was necessary, Ethan replied. The situation required clarity. Did it? Or did you just want to see his face when he realized? Ethan had ended the call without answering, because Helen was right and wrong simultaneously. He'd wanted clarity, yes. But not for Julian. For himself. To confirm that the choices he'd made, the life he'd constructed, the walls he'd built between his private self and his professional power, had been right. Necessary. Justified. Mara's departure had hurt, but not in the way she probably imagined. Not heartbreak. Something more fundamental, the realization that he could share a life with someone for years and still remain fundamentally unknown. That his commitment to privacy, to keeping his world separate, had created an intimacy that was real but incomplete. Honest but not fully truthful. He'd let her go because he couldn't explain without revealing, and revealing meant exposure he wasn't willing to risk. Not for her. Not for anyone. The work he did, the systems he managed, required a level of anonymity that personal relationships threatened. So he'd chosen the work. He'd chosen silence. And now silence was becoming its own kind of noise, echoing through decisions and consequences and the inevitable moment when all separated things came back into collision. His phone lit up. A message from Marcus. Davenport board meeting tomorrow. They're going to vote on abandoning the Roth deal and opening discussions with alternative buyers. You want in? Ethan stared at the message for a long moment. Then typed, send the proposal. But keep my name off the initial documentation. Let them discover it organically. This was the beginning of the endgame. The point where Julian would finally understand that the battle had been lost before it started. Where Mara would have to choose whether to stay attached to a sinking ship or jump into water whose depth she couldn't measure. And where Ethan would have to decide if remaining invisible was still worth what it cost him in terms of connection, understanding, and the very human need to be seen clearly by at least one other person. The Davenport board convened at 8 in the morning in a room that smelled of anxiety and expensive coffee. Julian wasn't invited, which told him everything he needed to know before the official notification arrived. He sat in his office, phone in hand, waiting for David to call with news he already understood would be catastrophic. The call came at 9:15. They're opening the bid process to alternative buyers, David said without preamble. Voted 7-2. They cited concerns about licensing stability and long-term partnership viability. Kensington got to them, Julian said flatly. Kensington didn't have to. Once the patent situation became clear, the board had fiduciary obligations to consider other options. Julian, I'm sorry, but this deal is dead. We can try to negotiate a minority position, but... No. Julian's voice was ice. I don't do minority positions. If I can't control it, I don't want it. After David hung up, Julian sat in silence for 20 minutes. Then he began making calls. Strategic partners. Political connections. People who owed him favors. If Ethan Cole wanted war, Julian would give him war. He'd spend every resource, burn every bridge, salt every earth necessary to ensure that Kensington's interference cost them more than it gained. What Julian didn't realize was that the war had been over before he'd known it started. And revenge, real revenge, didn't look like conflict. It looked like inevitability. Mara heard about the Davenport collapse from the news before Julian told her. She was having coffee at a bistro near her sister's apartment, scrolling through financial feeds, when the headline appeared, Davenport Tech opens acquisition talks after Roth deal fails. She called Julian immediately. I just saw. What happened? What happened is that your ex-boyfriend destroyed 6 months of work because apparently he's been nursing a grudge this entire time. Julian's voice was ragged. But it's fine. I have other options. Bigger opportunities. Davenport was small thinking anyway. It was the first time Mara had heard Julian lie to himself, and it unsettled her more than the news itself. Do you want me to come over? No. I need to work. I'll call you later. The line went dead. Mara set her phone down and stared at her coffee, watching cream swirl into patterns that dissolved as quickly as they formed. Around her, the bistro hummed with ordinary life. People worried about ordinary things. None of them were engaged to a man whose empire was crumbling, haunted by an ex who turned out to be the architect of that collapse. You look like someone just told you the earth is flat and showed you the edge. Simone slid into the opposite chair uninvited. Julian. The Davenport deal fell through. I know. It's all over the business feeds. Simone studied her sister with the particular intensity of someone who'd known you before you learned to hide. Are you going to talk to Ethan? I don't know what I'd say. How about, why did you let me think you were nobody for 3 years? Simone suggested. Or maybe, were you laughing at me the whole time? Those seem like reasonable starting points. He wasn't laughing. Mara said it with certainty she couldn't quite justify. That's not who he is. Who is he, though? Because apparently you dated him for 3 years and didn't know. Simone's tone softened. I'm not trying to be harsh. I'm trying to understand. What kind of person hides something that big from someone they're supposedly building a life with? It was the question Mara had been avoiding because the answer was uncomfortable. Someone who doesn't trust easily. Or someone who learned that showing people who you really are gives them power over you. She paused. Or someone who wanted to know if they could be loved for who they are instead of what they have. That's remarkably generous considering he's currently destroying your fiance's career. Is he though? Mara looked up. Or is Julian destroying his own career by trying to force a deal that was never going to work? Ethan didn't create the patent situation. Kensington owned those licenses before Julian ever approached Davenport. All Ethan did was decline to facilitate something that would have been a bad business decision. You're defending him. I'm being objective. But even as Mara said it, she recognized the lie. She was defending him. Because somewhere in the chaos of revelation and recrimination, she'd started to see the shape of what she'd actually walked away from. Not a small life but a chosen one. Not lack of ambition but surplus of control. Not weakness but the kind of strength that didn't need constant validation. She'd left because she thought Ethan was going nowhere. The truth was he'd already arrived and had been waiting patiently for her to notice. That afternoon, Ethan attended a meeting that would have been unremarkable to anyone not paying attention. The Davenport board, represented by the severe white-haired woman from the previous meeting, sat across from him reviewing the proposal Kensington had submitted through a carefully constructed web of intermediaries. This is generous, the woman, whose name was Margaret Caldwell, said carefully. Almost suspiciously so. Kensington invests for decades, not quarters, Ethan replied. We're interested in long-term stability, not quick returns. Davenport's technology has applications that won't mature for 5 to 7 years. We're willing to wait. And the board composition? We'd require 2 seats. Non-controlling but with veto rights on major strategic decisions. The remaining 7 seats stay with existing leadership. Day-to-day operations remain autonomous. Margaret exchanged glances with her colleague, a man named Robert whose reading glasses hung from a chain around his neck. You understand that accepting this offer means permanently closing the door on the Roth acquisition? I imagine that door is already closed, Ethan said mildly. It is. But accepting your offer makes it clear we're not just rejecting him, we're choosing you. In our world, that matters. Margaret leaned forward slightly. May I speak frankly, Mr. Cole? Please. Julian Roth is going to see this as a personal attack. He's already making calls, putting pressure on partners, trying to build a coalition against Kensington's interests in other markets. Are you prepared for that kind of sustained hostility? Mrs. Caldwell, Julian Roth doesn't have the resources or reach to materially impact Kensington's operations. He has visibility, which he mistakes for power. But visibility is just noise. It doesn't move markets. It doesn't change fundamentals. Ethan's tone remained calm, almost gentle. He'll exhaust himself fighting shadows while the actual work continues uninterrupted. Robert chuckled despite himself. You don't seem particularly concerned about making an enemy. I'm not making an enemy. I'm declining to be impressed by one. Ethan gathered his papers. Take the proposal to your full board. If the terms are acceptable, we can have preliminary agreements drafted by end of week. If not, Kensington will look elsewhere. But either way, the licensing agreements revert to us in 3 months. This offer simply determines whether Davenport survives that reversion or doesn't. The meeting ended with handshakes and the kind of professional courtesy that masked the reality that Ethan had just acquired control of a company without appearing to pursue it, solved a problem by allowing it to solve itself, and positioned Kensington as savior rather than aggressor. As he left the building, his phone buzzed. A text from a number he recognized but hadn't expected to hear from. Mara. I know you don't owe me explanations. But I need to understand. Can we talk? Ethan stood on the sidewalk, watching the city flow around him. He'd known this moment was coming, had recognized its inevitability the moment he'd agreed to meet with Julian directly. Revelation had consequences beyond business. It opened doors that discipline and distance had kept carefully locked. He could ignore the message. Could maintain the separation that had served him well for 8 years. Could protect the privacy that allowed him to operate effectively in worlds that rewarded invisibility. Or he could answer. Could offer the explanation she was asking for and the closure they both probably needed. Could risk whatever complications came from letting someone see behind the carefully maintained curtain. His thumb hovered over the screen. Then he typed, tomorrow. 2 p.m., there's a small park near the financial district. Riverside and 5th. I'll be on the east bench. The response came almost immediately. Thank you. Ethan pocketed his phone and continued walking, his mind already running through what he would and wouldn't say, what truth could be shared and what needed to remain protected. The conversation would be difficult. Mara would have questions he'd spent years learning not to answer. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the price of the life he'd built was occasionally having to explain it to people who'd earned the right to know. That evening, Julian's penthouse had the atmosphere of a war room. David was there, along with 2 other lawyers and a crisis management consultant whose fee structure included hazard pay. They were discussing options, strategies, ways to mitigate the reputational damage of such a public failure. We spin it, the consultant, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, said. You walked away because you identified fundamental structural problems that other buyers missed. You're being prudent, not beaten. That only works if another buyer doesn't immediately succeed where I failed, Julian countered. Then we make sure they fail too. Patricia's smile was cold. There are always ways to complicate acquisitions. Regulatory challenges. Partnership disputes. We make the next 18 months so difficult for whoever buys Davenport that the market remembers Julian Roth as the smart one who avoided a disaster. David looked uncomfortable. That's a significant resource commitment for what amounts to spite. It's not spite, Julian snapped. It's reputation management. If the market thinks Ethan Cole beat me, that perception affects every future deal. But if the market thinks I strategically withdrew from a poisoned opportunity, I look prescient. They talked for another 2 hours, building strategies that ranged from aggressive to borderline unethical. Julian listened, approved certain approaches, and felt the particular satisfaction that came from taking action, any action, against the sense of helplessness that had been choking him since the Kensington meeting. What he didn't know was that Mara was in the guest room, packing. Not everything. Just enough for a few days away. She'd listened to the raised voices, the plotting, the escalating commitment to a fight that couldn't be won, and recognized something she'd been avoiding. She'd traded one kind of blindness for another. She'd left Ethan because she couldn't see his power. She'd chosen Julian because his power was visible, performative, undeniable. But power that needed constant display was power that was fundamentally insecure. And Julian's response to being outmaneuvered wasn't strategic recalibration but escalating aggression. Ethan would never have responded this way. Ethan would have absorbed the loss, learned from it, and adjusted his position with such subtle precision that the next attempt would succeed before anyone noticed it was happening. That was the difference between visibility and control. Between performance and competence. She finished packing and sent Julian a text. I need a few days to think. Staying with Simone. We should talk when I'm back. She left before he could respond, before he could argue or charm or manipulate her into staying. She needed distance. Clarity. And tomorrow at 2 p.m., she needed answers to questions she was only now learning how to ask. Across the city, Ethan sat in his apartment, a single lamp illuminating the space. Tomorrow would be complicated. Mara would want explanations that required revealing operational details he'd never shared with anyone outside his immediate circle. She'd want to understand why he'd hidden so much, and the honest answer was complex. Part security protocol, part habit, part deep-seated belief that intimacy and influence were fundamentally incompatible. He'd been wrong about that last part. Loneliness had a cost that no amount of professional success offset. And if this conversation with Mara helped him understand that cost more clearly, if it forced him to articulate what he'd been avoiding for years, then perhaps it served a purpose beyond her need for closure. Perhaps it was his closure too. The park was nearly empty at 2 in the afternoon, just the muted sounds of distant traffic and wind moving through bare branches. Ethan sat on the east bench as promised, a figure so still he might have been part of the landscape. Mara saw him from 50 feet away and felt her pulse quicken with something between anticipation and dread. He stood as she approached, a gesture of courtesy that felt oddly formal given their history. Mara. Ethan. She sat, and he followed, maintaining a respectful distance between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Mara broke the silence with the question that had been burning since the revelation. Why didn't you tell me? Which part? His voice was calm, not defensive. Why didn't I tell you what I did for a living, or why didn't I correct you when you assumed I was something less? Both. Either. All of it. Ethan looked out at the empty playground, gathering thoughts with visible care. When I started with Kensington, I was 26. The position required absolute discretion. Not because the work was illegal or unethical, but because influence is most effective when it's invisible. Markets react to known actors. They adjust. They compensate. But anonymous capital, decisions that can't be attributed to specific individuals, those move differently. More efficiently. So you lied to everyone. I omitted. I never lied about what I did, I just didn't correct assumptions. He turned to face her. When we met, you asked what I did. I said I worked in financial analysis and advisory. That was true. You assumed that meant I was a mid-level analyst at someone else's firm. I'll let you assume. For 3 years. For 3 years, he acknowledged. Because telling you would have required telling you everything. The extent of the portfolio. The reach of the networks. The responsibility of managing systems that affect thousands of people's livelihoods. And once you knew, the relationship would have changed. You'd have seen me differently. Treated me differently. And I wanted, just once, to be known as something other than what I could provide or control. Mara felt anger and understanding warring in her chest. So I was what? An experiment. A way to play at being normal. You were someone I cared about who made me feel human instead of functional. Ethan's composure cracked slightly, emotion bleeding through. Do you know what it's like to walk into rooms where your presence shifts billions in value? To have every conversation weighted with people calculating what you might do for or to them? I didn't want that with you. I wanted coffee on Sunday mornings and arguments about whose turn it was to do dishes. I wanted something ordinary. But we weren't ordinary. That was an illusion. Yes. He didn't deny it. And when you left, when you said I had no ambition, no future worth investing in, I could have corrected you. Could have shown you documents, made calls, demonstrated exactly what you were walking away from. But that would have been manipulation. Keeping you through revelation rather than earning you through who I actually was. Who you actually were. Mara's voice rose. I didn't know who you actually were. That was the entire problem. You knew me better than most people ever will. Ethan's tone was quiet but firm. You knew how I thought. How I solved problems. What I valued. The work I do is just an application of that. The scope was different, but the person was the same. Mara stood, pacing a few steps before turning back. And now. The Davenport situation. Julian thinks you're punishing him for being with me. Julian thinks everything is about him. It's not. Ethan remained seated, watching her. The Davenport decision was made before you two announced anything. Kensington had already identified problems with their corporate structure that made them incompatible with our partnership model. Julian's approach, his track record, confirmed those concerns. Your relationship with him was and is irrelevant to business decisions. But you met with him directly. You revealed yourself. Why? For the first time, Ethan hesitated. Because he needed to understand that some battles are lost before they begin. And because I was tired of being invisible. The admission hung between them, vulnerable in a way Ethan rarely allowed himself to be. Mara sat back down, closer this time. You let me go. I did. Even though you could have fought for me. Could have shown me what you were and made me reconsider. Yes. Why? Because love that requires proof of worth isn't love. It's a negotiation. Ethan turned to face her fully. I wanted you to stay because you valued who I was in your apartment, not what I was in the boardrooms. When that wasn't enough, when you needed more visible success, more obvious trajectory, I had to accept that we wanted different things. Revealing everything to keep you would have changed the foundation of what we had. Made it transactional. Mara felt tears threatening and pushed them back. I was so stupid. You were human. You made a choice based on the information available and what you thought you needed. There's no stupidity in that, just different priorities. And Julian? Her voice was barely a whisper. What happens now? Julian will exhaust himself fighting ghosts. He'll make noise, threaten action, and try to build coalitions. None of it will matter. Kensington will acquire Davenport through intermediaries. The markets will adjust. Life continues. Ethan paused. What you do about your arrangement with him is your choice. I have no stake in that decision. Don't you think so? Mara searched his face. Don't you care at all? The silence stretched long enough that Mara thought he wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, almost too quiet to hear, he said, "I care that you're making choices that align with who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. If that's Julian, then I hope you're happy. If it's not, then I hope you find the courage to admit it." He stood then, preparing to leave. Mara stood too, her hand catching his arm. "Ethan. If I had known, if you had told me, would we still be together?" He looked at her hand on his sleeve, then at her face. "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe you would have stayed for the wrong reasons and we'd both be miserable. The past is whatever it was. We will deal with it now. And now." She released his arm but held his gaze. "What is now? Now you go back to your life. Figure out what you actually want. I go back to mine. Maybe our paths cross again someday, maybe they don't. Either way, I hope you find what you're looking for." He walked away then, his figure growing smaller against the winter afternoon. Mara stood watching until he disappeared around a corner, then sat back down on the bench, her mind spinning. 3 months later, the Davenport acquisition closed quietly. Kensington took majority control through a shell company that most people never connected to Ethan directly. Julian's campaign against the deal collapsed under its own weight, his resources depleted, his reputation damaged by increasingly desperate tactics. The engagement to Mara had been dissolved by mutual agreement after she'd spent 2 weeks at Simone's apartment, finally admitting to herself that contracts weren't the same as commitment, and visibility wasn't the same as substance. She never contacted Ethan again. Not because she didn't think about him, because she did, regularly, painfully. But because he'd been right. The past was whatever it was. And she needed to figure out who she was independent of either man's shadow before she could make any choice that mattered. Ethan continued his work, managing systems and decisions that most people never saw. Helen asked him once if he regretted the park conversation, if revealing so much had been worth whatever cost it carried. He'd thought about it for a long time before answering. "I regret not having it sooner. But timing is everything." She needed to ask. I needed to answer. Now we both know. Know what? Helen had pressed. That some things can't be rebuilt, only understood. And understanding is enough. The city moved on, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in its parks and penthouses. Markets rose and fell. Deals closed and collapsed. People made choices and lived with consequences. And somewhere in the machinery of it all, Ethan Cole continued his quiet work, a little less invisible than before, a little more willing to let the right people see clearly. It wasn't a happy ending. It wasn't an ending at all. It was just the truth, finally spoken, finally heard. And sometimes, in a world built on performance and perception, truth was the only real power worth having. If this story moved you, helped you see something differently, or made you think about the quiet power in your own life, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment about what resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories that challenge how we see success, relationships, and the masks we all wear. Real power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just waits for you to notice.